Everybody. Today we're going to talk about the long, winding, often violent road to the Civil War. This is probably going to be the longest lecture of the semester. There's just so much that I want to cover, so many sort of basic ideas and concepts that I just want to get on the table because we're not going to spend a ton of time thinking about the causes and origins of the war compared with the experience of the war and the consequences. So this is kind of our one shot. Future lectures probably won't be this long. And certainly feel free to take the time that you need to watch this. If it takes you a couple of sittings, that's totally fine. Okay, so let's get into it. First thing, big question, just how different were North and South in, say, the generation leading up to the Civil War? And when we think about this question, I think we tend to imagine that they were like very different places. They had to have been because they went to war with one another. But let's think about a few similarities too. They're roughly the same size, geographically speaking. Well, the population of the North was much larger, but they spanned about the same amount of territory. They were both, for the most part, rural. The North did have some growing urban centers, New York and Boston, Philadelphia. It was a more urban society, but it was a predominantly rural and agricultural society, just like the South. They spoke the same language. They had a common historical heritage, right? Common reference points, common holidays, like the 4th of July. They had common churches, although there were some important differences there, and the churches in the 2 decades leading up to the war begin to split over the issue of slavery. They had the same basic ideologies, particularly an attachment to the idea of individual liberty, an attachment, a belief in the idea of states' rights, local governance, resistance to centralized authority. That's not just a Southern idea. Many Northerners preach and believe in that idea and see it as essential for the preservation of liberty. And there's a belief in the United States as a sort of different path in the history of the world, a victorious story in the history of the world, a departure from old world European tyranny, and that there's a belief that this project must continue to progress, must continue to grow. And the way it would grow is through territorial expansion. If there's anything close to a consensus idea in the United States in the 1840s, 1850s, it's that the nation has to keep moving west, has to keep growing. North and South were both capitalist societies. What I mean by that is they were predicated on the idea of accumulating wealth through surplus value, right? The most powerful people in the society were concerned with doing that thing. Obviously, the difference came in the labor that produced that value, right? I'm going to talk a little bit more about that difference in just a minute. They were predicated on the idea of raising financing, investing capital, and putting it into projects that can hopefully bring higher returns. This could mean land or factories. It could also mean slaves, right? Slave property was financed by, among other things, Northern capital. And in both places, both societies, we see capitalist institutions emerging. There are finance, insurance, bookkeeping techniques that are emerging not only in New York City, not only on Wall Street, but in New Orleans and in Charleston and on plantations themselves. Okay, and one of the outcomes of this is that both North and South are quite unequal societies. The richest 1%, North and South, controls most of the property, controls most of the political power, and and the rest of the society is struggling a bit more to survive in what are dramatically changing economic conditions of the antebellum period. So there's a lot in common, but they have to be different, right? There have to be differences, or else why would they go to war? Take a look at this map. And this is a map, this is a sort of very basic map showing the Confederate States of America here in the red. The United States of America during the Civil War are in the dark blue, and the border states, which are also part of the United States of America. At the time, they never seceded, but they were slaveholding states. Many of their citizens went on to fight in the Confederacy. Here in what I think is light blue, although I'm colorblind, so if it's not light blue, don't laugh at me. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. This is West Virginia. West Virginia was part of Virginia until the Civil War, and then itself actually seceded rather than be part of the Confederacy, and that's where the state of West Virginia comes from. Okay, so this map suggests there's a difference, or else why would there be such separation, geographic separation? So let's think about what some of the differences might have been. What was the South? I put the article here up at the top in quotation marks because there isn't a single South. That's not that's a misleading descriptor, although it's a very common one. People often talk about the South, what the South is all about, what the South does, what the South is like. But this is a huge area. It's extremely diverse. It stretches from Texas to the gardens of Savannah, Georgia, to the factories of Richmond, Virginia, to the mountains of Tennessee. I mean, this is geographically, culturally, religiously, linguistically, a very diverse, very rich place. Okay, but there are some similarities throughout. For one, the South is hot as hell. I don't know how much that matters. There's a school of historiography going way back that would suggest that climate had everything to do with making the South what it was, perhaps. But it is something to have in common. Maybe a little bit more substantially, there is a degree, you could say, of like cultural anti-modernism. And we're going to read about this week when we think about the pro-slavery ideology. But what I basically mean by that is that there's a suspicion of a disdain for some of the what especially elite Southerners see as the corruptions of industrialism, of commercialism, of revolution, of ideas of liberal equality. There is a suspicion, an outright opposition to the idea of widespread or universal literacy, not only among enslaved people, which is a true social taboo in the Old South, but even among poor whites. And with that comes a more general rejection of the idea of equality and a support for hierarchy, a belief that some people are born to rule and others are born to be ruled. Some people can lead, some people cannot lead. Those people must work for those who can lead. Okay. There is in the Old South a tradition of honor, and this is something that a lot of historians wrote about for much of the 20th century. When they tried to think of why the South was distinct, they ended up on this idea of honor. And what that means is it's a sort of distinct masculine worldview. How one behaves in public, how one treats his equals, how one respects his superiors, but also how one is acknowledged by and revered by and respected by or feared by his inferiors, meaning women, meaning enslaved people, meaning poor whites. That those things are essential to the civilized order of a society. James Henry Hammond, who was, among many other things, a representative, a governor, a senator from the state of South Carolina, one of the most notable plantation owners, slaveholders of the antebellum period, a political theorist in his own right. He put it like this. He said, "Reputation is everything. Everything with me depends upon the estimation in which I am held." Right? This is a society where laws on the books don't matter all that much compared to how one's peers, how one's betters, how one's inferiors hold that person, right? It's a society about reputation. And if you were to damage someone's reputation, if you were to challenge someone's reputation, there could be consequences. At the end of this lecture, we're going to talk about a violent attack on a U.S. senator from Massachusetts over the issue of honor, over the issue of Southern honor. And I want you to think about some of these ideas when we're doing that. This is the caning of Charles Sumner. So we'll come back to that. And all that stuff's important. The anti-modernism is important. The idea of honor is important. But most important is the political economy of slavery. Okay. The South was a slave economy. It was what historians, what other scholars have called a slave society. Let's think about what that means. Okay, this isn't just a place where slavery exists. Okay, it's something bigger than that. There are not that many truly slave societies in human history, although slavery exists throughout much of human history in some form or another. But a slave society is a place where the relationship between the owners and the workers is defined across the society by ownership of the worker. And part of this, part of what makes a slave society is just an issue of numbers. How many enslaved people are there? How big a proportion of the workforce are they? In the antebellum South, it depends on the region, but there are many regions in the antebellum South where enslaved people make up more than half of the total population. Okay. And those places tend to produce a lot of economic and political power and direct the organization of the society. So that the places where there are fewer enslaved people, in the antebellum South, that would have been, say, the mountains of Appalachia, North Carolina, Tennessee, down into Georgia, land where a lot of poor whites lived. Those places really lack influence in the society. They're there, but the power is held by the slaveholder. Okay. And the whole social structure is based on this relationship of master and slave. That is the core relationship of the society. The society is a hierarchy in which people who are owned form the base, and it is a large and essential base. The economy would collapse without it. Okay, that's a slave society. And in the 40 years before the Civil War, the 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the slave society of the South is dynamic. It's growing, it's changing. In those 40 years, there is a thing called the domestic slave trade. As planters are moving into new cotton growing territory, this is in the lower Mississippi Valley from about New Orleans up to Memphis. This is in a region called the Black Belt that stretches from mid-Georgia across Alabama and Mississippi and into Louisiana. This is in East Texas. This is the new hub of cotton production in the entire world. And these planters need workers. At the same time this is happening, the soils, the planting soils of the Upper South, places that had long been settled, places like Virginia, they're giving way. They're not as vibrant as they used to be. slave labor on plantations is not as essential as it once had been. And so a domestic slave trade emerges as Upper South slaveholders begin selling slave property into the South, into the Deep South, I should say. In the 40 years before the Civil War, about 2 million slaves, 2 million, were sold from the Upper South down into the Deep South, into the cotton economy. 2/3 of enslaved people who were sold in the domestic slave trade came from those Upper South states, from Virginia, Maryland, Delaware, etc. And this is also an important point to note. A significant portion of this migration was children. Children held value in the Old South, especially as they got just a little older, around the ages of 8, 9, 10, when they survived their earliest childhood. They were valuable because there was potential in them. They had potential as laborers. They had a long life, theoretically, ahead. And so 1/3 of children in the Upper South were sold before the age of 10 into slavery. 1/3. Staggering statistics. That's what the domestic slave trade was. The other thing that indicates to us, though, is that slavery was booming, that the cotton economy was booming in those 40 years. That movement would not have been happening. You would not have the mass migration, forced migration of labor into this region if there wasn't a lot of money coming out of there and a lot of work to be done. Economic historians have crunched the numbers on this. They found that slavery was extremely profitable throughout the antebellum period. In fact, there's an old myth that would say that slavery was not profitable, that it was dying out, and that it was going to die on its own. There's no way to know if it was going to die on its own in the long run. We can't really say that. But we do know that it was not dying out at the time of the war. The most profitable cotton crops in the history of the antebellum United States were in the years immediately preceding the war, including in 1860, the year Abraham Lincoln was elected president. The cotton crop doubled every single decade from 1820 to 1860. Doubled. There is no industry in the contemporary US that has maintained that kind of growth over the course of 40 years. That is a staggering amount of growth. And so it became the bedrock, not just of the Southern economy, but the entire national economy. It was by far, cotton was by far the nation's #1 export. And the South was the world's primary source of cotton, even as early as the 1820s. The closest thing I can compare this to in our world right now, I think there's probably many examples we could think of, but one that we all know about. Think of this as the sort of Saudi Arabia or the Venezuela, what those countries are to oil in the 20th century and into the 21st century, the South is to cotton, all right? It's not only that they produce a lot of it, that there's a lot of money coming in, but other economies are growing to depend on this. Other economies need this supply to keep going. That's English industrial economy, Northern American industrial economy are dependent on this. Okay, so in short, for all their honor, for all their anti-modernism, for all their ideology, their pro-slavery ideology, at the end of the day, the Old South is just an immensely powerful, dynamic place that is essential to the transformation of the whole global economy in the 19th century. This is a place that's producing the cotton that fuels the Industrial Revolution. The riches of great American cities, great European cities are coming out of the plantations of the South. Cities like New York and Liverpool are really, in no small part, built in the 19th century on the product of Southern slave labor. And they, in turn, are pumping their capital back into the South, investing in new territory, investing in enslaved people, investing in planters. With that comes the growth of slavery, as I said before. Just a couple quick numbers for you to keep in mind so you have a sense of scale here. By 1860, there is approximately 4 million enslaved people in the United States. As a financial asset, they were worth about $3.5 billion. Today, that would be the equivalent of about 75 to 80 billion dollars. And just to give you a sense of what that means, just when people put things in terms of dollars, it can be hard to get a sense of like, is that, I mean, it sounds like a lot, right? Yeah, it's a lot. It is worth, slave property in the antebellum period is worth more than all of the rest of the productive capacity of the United States, right? There's more money in enslaved people than there is in, say, factories or railroads. By far the most valuable financial asset in the United States in the antebellum period is enslaved people. The only thing that would be worth more, theoretically, is the land itself, the continent of North America itself. And there's no way to put an exact valuation on that. What do you think comes of something like this? Right? What is the outcome of that kind of concentrated economic power, just raw economic power? Slaveholders control the most valuable financial asset in the entire country, and they use that asset to produce the most important export in the country. They use that asset to transform the global economy. Well, the thing that comes from that is political power. Okay. Antebellum Southern elites had a lot of political power. Some of you may know these things, but I'll quickly run through them just to give you, again, a sense of scale of this power. 2/3 of US presidents before the Civil War were slaveholders. Others who were not slaveholders were often deeply sympathetic to the cause of slavery, or they were embedded in political party machines that forced them to work with slaveholders to protect and advance the interests of slavery. James Buchanan, who's the last president before Lincoln's election, before the Civil War, was from Pennsylvania. He was not a slaveholder, but he was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party needed to protect slaveholders. It was one of its core interests. And so he was working constantly in the interests of slaveholders. Okay. James K. Polk, president I'm going to talk about just a little bit more in just a minute here. He was the architect of the Mexican War, deeply influential slaveholding president who bought and sold slaves from the Oval Office. It was like a way he would de-stress, right? It's like playing the stock market today. The class of men who would establish the Confederate States of America, who would lead the march to secession, they had been central figures in the federal government of the United States. These were not outsiders. These were not minority figures. These were some of the most powerful people in the United States in the years before the Civil War. Jefferson Davis, he's here on the left. He became the president of the Confederacy. Davis was a millionaire cotton planter in Mississippi, but he had also been a United States senator. And before that, in the administration of Franklin Pierce, a non-slaveholding president, Davis was the Secretary of War. Today, that would be the Secretary of Defense. Right? We all know that's one of the most influential positions in the federal government, an essential cabinet post. Alexander Stephens, he's in the middle here, looks like a small boy. Stephens was the vice president of the Confederacy. For many years, he was a congressman from Georgia before the war and a leading member of the Whig Party. Robert E. Lee on the right. Robert E. Lee, I think we all know who that is. Today, he's really the face of the Confederacy. He's the face of the Old South. but Lee had been the superintendent of West Point before the war. That's the college where U.S. military officers are trained. It's in New York. Okay. I'm going to move on to the north in just 1 second. One last thing I want to note, though. I'm spending a lot of time talking about the Southern elite here because we're talking about the road to war. And the road to a war goes through the elite in North and South. These are the decision makers. These are the people who are in Congress. These are the people who are running the political parties. So that's who I want to focus my time on if I'm going to have to. But again, the South was a diverse place. It was not just a world of super elite planters and enslaved people. In addition to 4 million enslaved African Americans, the South is home to millions and millions of poor whites, some of whom might have small land holdings. Some of them have no land at all. They are renters. They are themselves enmeshed in the cash crop economy. Their lives are frequently upended by their wealthier neighbors' accumulations of land and wealth. But they're there, okay? They are going to be the people who fight and die for the Confederacy, and we're going to talk a bit about why they would do that in the next few weeks, especially when we read Drew Faust's book about dying. But just remember, this is a more diverse place, and the vast majority of people do not have this power. The vast majority of people are either enslaved or they're existing in very meager circumstances, trying to live off the land and try to extract some value out of this booming capitalist slave society. Okay, let's talk about the North. And I did the same thing here. The North? Is there really only one North? Of course not. The Northern United States in the antebellum period is one of the most diverse places on Earth. It stretches from the woods of northern Maine out to the plains of Iowa. And it was, like the South, a vibrant, booming economic place. But when we think about the North, instead of slave society, what we're thinking about is a market society. Now, what's that mean? Market society was dynamic. It was consumerist. It was commercial. It was based on the growing prevalence of wage labor, people going out into the world and earning money for their work. And what that meant was that people in the North relied on money for survival. That probably sounds like not a very interesting thing, right? Every single one of us relies on money for survival. What does that even mean? But the parents of many of these people, right? 18th century Americans, many early 19th century Americans, they didn't exclusively or at all rely on money for survival. They relied on subsistence labor. They would grow their own crops. They would rely on trade with their neighbors. They would rely on a more sort of communal approach to producing the necessities of everyday life. But that's increasingly untenable in the North. Labor is increasingly a commodity for sale in a marketplace, not just a thing you do to produce what you need to survive. Its purpose is to generate money to fund one's own welfare, but also to generate wealth for the people who organize and own that labor. And the individual worker has to go out into this new market society and sell their labor. They have to go and they have to find a place to work. They have to explain what they can do there. And then they're going to earn some kind of wages and then use those to buy the necessities of life. That's a change. That's a very significant change between the late 18th century, the era of the Revolution and the founding, and the market society that's really taking hold in the 1820s and 1830s. What that means, among other things, is that people's lives are lived at greater distances than they had been before. one's survival, but also one's pleasure, can come from goods, from things that are produced far away. You live in New England, you might rely on wheat for bread that comes from Rochester, New York, or comes from Ohio, hundreds of miles away. This process, and you might rely on money that you earn from producing a good that is sold hundreds of miles away, to be clear. This process is fueled by technology, by infrastructure, new developments in both of these areas. That means canals. This is the Erie Canal, stretching from Lake Erie to the Hudson River, connecting the Great Lakes economy to the Atlantic. This means steamboats. It means telegraphs. It means railroads, increasingly. It also means cities. In a society like this, population centers begin to develop quite rapidly. They bring together these wage workers, people who now work in shipping, people who work in manufacturing. That's where they're earning their wages. Mobility in market society is essential. Children grow up, but then they have to leave. They can't simply inherit their parents' land as they would have in an earlier time and continue working it. They have to go find work in cities. They have to go find land in new places further west, and they end up in Ohio. They end up in Michigan. They end up in Wisconsin. Wherever they need to go to find an opportunity to earn their livelihood. Nothing is guaranteed in the way that it may have felt in an earlier time. And what this means is some people are getting really wealthy. There's a lot of money to be earned in this society. And it also means that some people are feeling very insecure because there's no sure thing. One last point too, this is a society that's growing rapidly. Okay, I talked about the way the Southern economy was booming, the cotton production was doubling every decade. A similar thing is happening with the population of the North. Between 1820s and the 1850s, the population of the North was doubling. And if that rate had continued, the population of the United States today would be 1.5 billion. It's about 350 million, 330 million, something like that. So this is an amazing, booming population. What do you think that would be like to live through? The norms, the expectations of the society before you are completely upended. The bedrock that you thought you could depend on is not there anymore. People are earning all kinds of money, but they're doing it in ways that did not exist a generation before. Frankly, in many ways, it sounds like the world we're living in right now, but it's even more fundamental than that. The change is even more fundamental than what we've experienced now. It was a time of great social dislocation, confusion, anxiety, doubt. Young people, including young women, leave the domestic rural worlds of their families and they move into these growing industrial cities. This is a picture of clock out time at the Lowell Mills in Massachusetts. What you see here is young women, you see children, you also see many men, people who came from rural places. These people came from New Hampshire, they came from Western Massachusetts, they came from Maine, and they came to earn wages in these large cotton mills you see in the background. And this is unlike anything that their parents had experienced. There's no comparison for this. And there's good things about this. There are pleasures to be had in this world, but there's also a lot of confusion. In addition to this kind of mobility and movement away from home, there were, as there have been in the 20th and 21st centuries, economic calamities, depressions. In the 19th century, they called these panics. It's the panic of 1837, which is the worst financial collapse of the antebellum period. And in a world where people depend on money and suddenly there is no money, things can get ugly very fast, and they do throughout the country, but especially in the North in the 1830s. In the streets of Boston, suddenly there are thousands of hungry beggars. Same in the streets of New York, streets of Cincinnati. Another thing that happens here, and with this comes the closure of banks, the tightening of the money supply. It's a dark time. It takes almost a decade to truly recover from this, and it really scars people. In the midst of all of this, there are mass waves of immigration. By the 1850s, Boston and New York were 50% immigrant communities. 50% of the people who lived in Boston and New York in the 1850s had been born in another country. Most of those are coming from Ireland or from Prussia, and many of them are Catholic, which means there is this new religious other entering the society, a religious other that is seen as dangerous, as loyal to another force, the Pope, rather than to American society. This is a new group of people who might upend the social contract of America. So in this period, there's a great deal of anti-immigrant politics, violence against immigrants, conspiratorial thinking that immigrants are going to destroy the fabric of civilization. These are Irish Catholics who are going to do this because Irish Catholics worship the Pope and they don't understand what it means to be a free person, and they can never understand it. So it's a time of fear. It's a time of doubt. It's a time of insecurity. And to soothe these things, to make sense of this world, Americans turn to religion, as they often have. It's the age of the Second Great Awakening. It's Americans who not only being more passionate about their religious practice, but also being very inventive. New churches, new faiths are emerging. Most famous of these is the Church of Latter-day Saints. The Mormons emerge out of this cauldron of antebellum change. There's also a turn to reform, towards trying to make this world a better place. The issues of reform, the things that people are concerned with: mitigating poverty, mitigating violence against animals, violence like blood sport, like bare knuckle boxing, gambling, temperance is a huge issue, trying to control how much Northerners drink, which was a lot. And most importantly is the anti-slavery movement, but I'm going to talk about that in just a second. And what all these movements have in common is that they're trying to make sense of what happens to a society when it's uprooted from its traditions, when it's uprooted from its attachments to place, when old institutions that can tell you what is right and what is wrong, things like home and family, no longer have the power that they once had. Okay, and what all these reformers are trying to figure out is, well, what moral foundation keeps the society together? What are the boundaries of good behavior in a society where the old institutions aren't as powerful anymore? How do you know what is acceptable, what is ethical, what is moral? This is the question that reformers are asking in the 30 plus years leading up to the Civil War. So out of this whole maelstrom, out of the storm of economic change, population growth, immigration, industrial capitalism, wage labor, etc., that is the antebellum North, there's two very general ideologies that emerge. And there are way more than two. I want to be clear. Okay, but we're going to focus on two in a very general sense, again, that can help us understand the origins of the war specifically. But you could spend a whole lifetime just thinking about antebellum political culture, antebellum social life, and you would never reach the end of it. It's so diverse. But these two are crucial for understanding the war. The first one is what the historian Eric Foner has described as free labor ideology. I would say if you could identify a single mainstream idea in the antebellum North, this would probably be it. Okay, and basically what this is the belief that market society created a path to true social and economic equality, that free labor ideology, this was a justification of the North's peculiar capitalistic market society. It was the belief that an industrious, temperate, moral man who is born with little or nothing can achieve true economic and political independence. And he can do that by eventually owning property, right? Being the master of his own domain so that no one could tell him what to do. And when you have an entire civilization of people like that, of truly free people, then you have people who are not corrupted by outside influences. People who can make decisions for themselves without someone buying them off, right? Crucial to this, obviously, is access to some kind of land ownership. This is the radical idea of the free labor ideology. If every man can own his own plot of land, his behavior will be moral, he will be virtuous, and the government will be a product of the combined virtuosity of all of these people. That means you need a lot of land, though, right? That means you need to expand constantly, and that's going to be a problem because there are already people in the West. Native civilizations are there. It also, in addition to land, it requires a degree of fairness. It can only take shape if every social class is playing by the same rules. And that means that Northerners were very, very suspicious. And when I say Northerners, I'm speaking very generally, of course. They're very, very suspicious of any concentration of power. They don't like monopolies. They don't like conspiracy. This is why there's such vehement fear of Freemasons in the antebellum North. What are they up to? What are they working on? They seem to have some kind of relationships that the rest of us don't know about. That seems unfair. This is another reason they don't like Catholics, right? What are they up to? What is that relationship with the Pope? Is that fair? What are they going to do to me? Am I going to be left on the outside here? But this is especially the reason they don't like slavery. Okay. In antebellum America, no single institution represented the idea of monopoly and unfair concentrations of power like slavery. They're afraid of Catholics. They do not, frankly, many free labor ideologues hate Catholics. They hate the Irish. But that pales in comparison to how much they fear slaveholders. Southern society, to the Northern perspective, was what happened when a few seized all the power and all the resources from the many. Southern society in the Northern perspective was backwards. It was uneducated. It was violent. It was arbitrary. And crucially, it did not dignify labor. It held labor in an undignified position. To the free labor ideologue, the ethic of hard work was everything. It was the central ethic of civilization. And the image of the slaveholder, right, this man who loafed, who luxuriated, who profited from the labor of others, and held those others in a lower position of esteem. That was the opposite of every single thing that they believed in. Okay, in short, free labor ideology held the belief that government did have a role. Government could promote this kind of hard work and personal independence. It could open up new land. It could invest in education, things like this. But the reverse was also true. Government, in the hands of hostile forces, particularly slaveholders, would eliminate independence, and it would turn common people into the dependents of elites. You would become just like those poor southern whites, scraping off the land and hoping that someone throws you some scraps. And the result would be that the country's economic, industrial, agricultural, intellectual capacities would be untapped. People would not achieve all that they were born to achieve if the slaveholders got their way. It's a very important thing to keep in mind here. This is not a universalist vision. Okay, the free labor ideology, the ideology of free labor and free soil, was not something that northern white men believed everybody could attain. It was a specific vision of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, slaveholders, African Americans, and very importantly, Native Americans do not really have a place in this society. And they're later going to be, after the Civil War, there's going to be free labor ideologues who say, no, we can train Native Americans to become like us. The idea of kill the Indian, save the man. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. That's a bit down the road, and that's a sort of reformist take on the free labor ideology. But in the antebellum period, that's not very widespread, right? Instead, there's a belief that those groups, African Americans, Native Americans, frankly Catholics, but also slaveholders, they cannot properly take advantage of the great bounty that is North America. They can't produce all that the land can produce, and they can't, and most importantly, independence, freedom. Okay, so that's one ideology. And like I said, probably the closest thing to mainstream thinking in the antebellum North. But it's not the only one. There's another ideology that's floating around as well. And that one is abolitionism. It's important to distinguish between abolitionism and this kind of mainstream free labor ideology, which was anti-slavery, but not necessarily abolitionist. And there is some crossover between the two, but they are more or less exclusive of one another. Abolitionists are the opponents of slavery. They want to destroy slavery where it exists, right? They are concerned with the welfare of enslaved people. Free labor advocates are not, right? It's not really that much of a concern what goes on a southern plantation, as long as that doesn't happen in Iowa or Wisconsin or in Oregon, or God forbid in New York. They're not really that concerned. Abolitionists are. Why are they? I think is a question worth asking. It's easy to take for granted. Well, slavery was evil, so they were doing the right thing. Yeah, but why did they think slavery was evil? How did that happen? And that's a huge historical question. That's a question that historians debate voraciously. Is that very? Yeah. Viciously in some states, in some moments. Why oppose slavery so strongly? I have a few ideas. Because abolitionism really is taking root in the 1820s and 30s. So we can say, well, what's happening in that moment? What's happening in American society that would lead to the production of this kind of ideology, that slavery is evil, and that enslaved people are actually the equals of free people? One thing that's happening is, like I said before, slavery is just much more central to American life in the antebellum period than it had been before. It's growing, it's booming, there's no avoiding it. So that's one thing. Another thing, this whole market revolution, all these technological innovations, all these infrastructural developments in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, they make the world a smaller place. Ideas can spread faster. And so if you live in Massachusetts, Virginia is closer than it has ever been. South Carolina is closer than it has ever been, which means it's harder to ignore what happens in Virginia and South Carolina. It's harder to ignore what happens on the plantations of Alabama. This is an important point. Commercialization of a society means that distant places are more economically dependent on one another, and that changes the moral calculus of everyday life. Suddenly, a farmer in Western Massachusetts who's wearing a cotton shirt becomes embroiled in the slave economy, and they're aware of this, right? Commercialization breeds a new degree or a new sense of moral responsibility for things that are way outside of your everyday existence, things you might never actually encounter in a first-person sense. And then lastly, with all of these things, there is this booming religious awakening, the Second Great Awakening. And there's a rapid spread of Christian revivalism and charismatic religious leadership, and out of this becomes a renewed sense that slavery is a sin in the eyes of God, that enslaved people are the children of God, and that slavery has to be abolished. That if slavery is abolished, the second coming of Christ may be right around the corner, right? This has to happen. Radical abolitionists take this all a step further. This is folks like William Lloyd Garrison there on the left, Angelina and Sarah Grimke in the center, Frederick Douglass, most famous probably of all of them. Radical abolitionists, they call for immediate, unconditional, uncompensated emancipation. We're going to end slavery, and we're not going to pay slaveholders for all that property that we're taking. Okay, this is just going to end, because to pay them would be to justify the system, right? In the 1830s, radical abolitionists are really picking up their political momentum. They begin publishing a newspaper, The Liberator, in Boston. They organized the American Anti-Slavery Society in 1833. That's the first national organization devoted to immediate emancipation. They grow quite quickly. There's 200,000 Northern members of the American Anti-Slavery Society by 1840. 200,000. There's 2,000 local chapters. They're relying on the new technologies of the day to spread their message. They're embracing mass communications. There are anti-slavery almanacs. There are anti-slavery fairs. People come together and they not only preach the ideals of abolition, but they sell goods that are made by free labor instead of slave labor. There is children's literature of the abolition movement to help children understand what slavery is and why it is evil. And then most important, there's this new genre, literary genre, of the slave narrative. In the decades before the Civil War, abolitionists publish more than 100 narratives of formerly enslaved people who have escaped, so that they can communicate what the experience of slavery was. And it's really based on these narratives that we come to really understand antebellum slavery. So much of what we think and know about antebellum slavery comes from these narratives by people like Frederick Douglass, who was born in slavery. These are cheap books. You can buy them. Anybody can buy them. Even in the straitened days of the Panic of 1837, it's possible to go out and buy a slave narrative, to read this extremely gripping, riveting, horrifying, tragic tale of slavery. And so Northerners are coming to have a much more intimate sense of Southern slavery. And that's where the abolition movement's really coming out of. Abolitionists are always a minority. There isn't really a moment when you could say the majority of Northerners are interested in the abolition of slavery, although the last 2 years of the Civil War might be that moment. We'll think about that when we get to thinking about why soldiers were fighting, but there is a noticeable shift after the Emancipation Proclamation, when it becomes clear that this is going to be a war to end slavery, not just to preserve the Union. Abolition and free labor ideology, they have an interesting relationship with one another. Not all adherents of one ideology accept the other, right? Like I said, there's a lot of free labor ideologues who simply don't care about abolition. But there's also a lot of abolitionists who recognize the dangers of free labor ideology, who see um, the welfare of wage workers as very important, who recognize that the free labor system might exploit African Americans, might exploit poor whites, and they speak up about that. So there is a lot of difference, but they do also have a lot of common ground. And there's a lot of abolitionists who are free labor advocates. When those two unite, and they would unite more or less in the late 1850s in the new political party, the Republican Party, when they unite, that's going to form a truly Northern consensus, a belief that slavery simply cannot continue to expand and really can no longer exist if free labor ideals are going to exist, right? Free labor advocates are going to have to come around to the ideas of abolitionism at some point. Okay, get to the final section of this lecture, and here I'm just going to do a blow-by-blow of the sectional crisis. I'm going to talk about the whole lead up. What are these kind of cascading political crises that bring us to civil war? I'm going to try to move as quickly as I can here. There's so much to cover. What we have in the generation before the war is we have these two systems that are both very powerful, both growing, both interested in expanding west, and both recognizing that the victory of one is a threat to the other. It becomes a zero-sum game. This is just politics at this point, and it's high-stakes politics with very little room for compromise, although, as I'm going to show you in just a second here, there's a lot of attempts at compromise. Okay, Mexican War. This is really the essential turning point in the sectional crisis. It's 1846. James K. Polk is the president. He's a Democrat. He's a slaveholder from Tennessee. And this is a war that is explicitly about expanding American territory. And contemporaries understood this. In 1846, U.S. troops on the border with Mexico provoke a confrontation with Mexican military. Based on that confrontation, Congress declares war. By the end of the year, the U.S. has established dominion over Southern California. By 1847, U.S. forces have captured Mexico City. By 1848, the war is over, and in the peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the U.S. obtains this. It obtains Western Texas, most of the state of Texas, actually. It obtains New Mexico, significant portions of Colorado, all of what becomes Utah, most of what becomes Arizona, the rest the U.S. will purchase in the 1850s, all of what becomes Nevada, all of what becomes California. Just step back for a second. From the 21st century perspective, if you're not aware of this, the two central economic hubs of American life today are Texas and California. It is hard to overstate just how valuable the territory that comes out of the Mexican War is. It is really American life, right? Comes out of this. There's also a portion of Wyoming, which I had not realized until recently. Some Americans celebrate this. This is just a wonderful thing for a lot of Americans. The fact that California is now going to be part of the United States. Emerson, though, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he's sitting in Concord, Massachusetts, and he's got different thoughts. And many New Englanders, many Northerners share these thoughts, which is suspicion, discontent, dissent, outright fear that this might not be such a good thing. Emerson writes in his diary, "The United States will conquer Mexico." It's in 1846. "But it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic which will bring him down in turn. Mexico will poison us. Mexico will poison us." That is about as prescient a statement as you can find in the 1840s. regarding Polk's justification of the war, Abraham Lincoln, he's then in Congress. He's a young congressman in his only term in the House of Representatives. He says, this is the half-insane mumbling of a fever dream. BS. He thinks it's BS, and he thinks it's great danger, like Emerson. This is a war of national expansion. But they also see it. Emerson as an abolitionist, Lincoln as a free labor advocate, they see this as really a war for the expansion of slavery. You look at that landscape, you see most of that is beneath the old 3630 line, or much of it, right here, running along the borders of what is then Indian Territory, what becomes Oklahoma much later. But all of this land in Texas, all this land in New Mexico, all this land in Arizona, potentially this land in Southern California could be a slave territory. Northerners are thinking, is slavery now going to be the labor system of railroad construction? Is it going to be the labor system of mining in the Rocky Mountains? This is what's on the table in the wake of the Mexican cession here in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Southern statesmen, for their part, they agree. Yes, because if slavery is not going to grow, then it will die. That's their belief. It has to grow. It has to keep moving. We have to have an outlet for slave property. Just like Virginians were able to sell their slaves to us in the past 40 years, we need to be able to have an outlet. The cotton economy might not last forever, but we as a civilization must. That's what they're thinking. They also know there's going to be more free states. And with those free states, there's going to be free state senators, free state congressmen. And if we don't keep pushing west, we will lose the balance of power in Congress, and we will disappear. Okay, next. It's Compromise of 1850. The Mexican War immediately creates a political crisis in Washington, and this compromise is an attempt to negotiate that crisis. And the most immediate problem is California. Gold has been discovered in 1849. People are rushing into California to mine that gold. The population is skyrocketing, which means that's going to be a state. Is that going to be a free state or a slave state? Here's what John C. Calhoun has to say. John C. Calhoun had been the vice president of the United States, a senator from South Carolina, and really the figure, the ultimate figure of Southern slave society, the most influential person probably in the Old South. He's near his death. He's going to die in 1850. But earlier in the year, here's what he says. California's admittance as a free state would let the South know slavery had no future, and the Southern states would have to separate. That's what he says. He calls it the Southern Address. So Calhoun says this is it. And many people in the United States think, okay, this is the moment of secession in 1850. Old political leaders, Daniel Webster from Massachusetts, Henry Clay from Kentucky, they come together, they try to find some kind of compromise. These guys are going to die soon too. They're at the end of their political careers, and they have never found a way to solve the sectional crisis. This is their chance. They come up with a multi-part plan to try and hold off, give everybody a little something. There's a lot more than just California coming in that's causing disputes, it's causing controversy at this time. And the Compromise of 1850 is an attempt to address a lot of things at once. Here's what it does. California is admitted as a free state. Okay. But to get the South to accept that, this land to the west here, the land that becomes New Mexico and Utah territories, those are going to be created, which means that they no longer are going to be belonging to Texas. Texas has some claim on that land. So Congress says, no, those are going to be new territories. And the reason Southerners like this is it means there's a potential that those could then become slave territories. So yeah, California will be a free state, but there's a potential that there'll be some new slave states coming down the pike. Okay, so that's one for one. Here's another one for Northerners, especially for abolitionists. The slave trade will be abolished in Washington, D.C. I don't know if anybody here's ever seen 12 Years a Slave, but there's a scene in that movie in a slave pen, right? Slave sales are taking place right in the shadow of the Capitol building. And this had long been controversial in the North, that the seat of American power was also a vibrant slave trading hub. So that's abolished. Congress has dominion over DC, it's a territory. Okay, in return for that, South gets something that it has wanted for a long time, which is a strengthened, emboldened Fugitive Slave Act. Surely we've heard of the Underground Railroad. Enslaved people throughout the antebellum period escaped in droves, thousands of them, into the North. And this had long bothered slaveholders, that they had no way to go and get what they saw as their escaped property. This law says the federal government's going to go do that. We're going to send federal marshals into northern communities. We're going to send federal troops into Amherst, Massachusetts, small town, an abolitionist town. We're going to send federal troops into Yellow Springs, Ohio, or Oberlin, Ohio. We're going to send federal troops into Boston, into New York City, and they're going to get escaped slaves and they're going to bring them back to slavery. Mentioned before, Northerners cared about states' rights. This is their states' rights moment. The federal government is just going to send troops into our own communities and seize people who belong to our community. In the wake of this, 20,000 African Americans, approximately 20,000 African Americans, move into Canada. They leave the North for good. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second. That Fugitive Slave Act is going to be a constant source of controversy and violence throughout the decade to come. Okay, 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe publishes Uncle Tom's Cabin, perhaps one of the most important books ever published outside of the Bible. It excoriates slavery. It electrifies American culture. Everybody knows this book. It really transforms American culture. It's probably the most important single piece of sort of cultural production in the history of the United States, alongside some of Lincoln's speeches, maybe. 1854, that fugitive slave law, the government is enforcing it. 3,000 federal troops move into the city of Boston to capture a single man, Anthony Burns, slave who had escaped from Virginia the year before and was living in Boston. The people of Boston are up in arms. They drape black crepe throughout the city to show the city's mourning that this has happened. Henry David Thoreau says that his thoughts are death to the state. He means the state of Massachusetts for assisting in this, and the state, the federal state as well. This is a galvanizing moment. Abolitionists begin to think, I think we're going to need to be a little bit more violent. And they are. They much more violently resist federal interventions in the Fugitive Slave Law. 1854 as well, Kansas-Nebraska Act. Kansas-Nebraska Act might be the most important single piece of legislation in the history of the United States. It's up there for sure. It's a law drafted by Democrat Stephen Douglas from Illinois. Stephen Douglas, a young guy. He's one of the most influential young members of Congress. He's a rival of Abraham Lincoln's. And what the act does is it holds the Democratic Party together in an attempt to give slaveholders a reason to stay in the party. What it does is it abolishes the Missouri Compromise of 1820. So we're familiar with this idea that slavery is in the South, not in the North. Well, that's really the Compromise of 1820 says that, right? Slavery cannot exist above this 3630 parallel. By abolishing that old law, that law was the bedrock of American politics. By abolishing that law, what this has done is it's essentially said slavery can spread to any territory in the West, as long as the citizens of that territory accept it. Free labor ideologues find this horrifying. They can't accept it. And the Whig Party, at one time, this really powerful national party that has a southern and a northern coalition, they split. The Whigs had been the party of the young Abraham Lincoln. The Whigs had been the party of Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, right? So that party dissolves in the wake of Kansas, Nebraska. There's a vacuum in American politics, and within just a day or so, a new party is already beginning to take shape, literally overnight. But especially in the few weeks after this, they're calling themselves for a while the Anti-Kansas Party. For these people, they spread from Maine to Iowa. The loss of the Missouri Compromise is an absolute devastation, right? The Missouri Compromise was how they understood their future. We will be able to move west. There will not be slavery there. That's gone. And out of this fear, they form a new political party. They quickly change their name to the Republican Party. This is the birth of the Republican Party. Within about 6 months of their formation, in the spring of 1854, within about 6 months in November, they elect 100 members to the House of Representatives. And within 2 years, they nearly win the presidency in 1856. And then within 6 years, they do win the presidency with Abraham Lincoln's election. This is a Yankee party. This is a Northern party. Slaveholders know it. Slaveholders are terrified of this. And their core ideology is the thing I mentioned earlier, this free labor ideology. But abolitionists also begin to join their ranks as well. Okay, 1856 to 1859, Bleeding Kansas. After Kansas, Nebraska says, whoever lives in Kansas can say if it's going to be free or slave. Pro-slavery and abolitionist groups flood in there. They are heavily armed. They're migrating to Kansas, and they're going to try to establish it as a free or a slave state. And they go to war with one another. At the same time, in Washington, that this is happening out in Kansas, in Washington, D.C., a South Carolina congressman named Preston Brooks beats Massachusetts Senator Charles Sumner, a Republican. He's probably the most abolitionist member of the U.S. Senate. Brooks beats him on the floor of the Senate nearly to death for insulting the South. That's that honor that I was talking about at the beginning. The nation in 1856 is completely engulfed in violence, in other words. 1857, let me just, one moment. (1857) Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott was an enslaved man who had sued for his freedom. His case was working its way through the courts throughout the 1850s. In 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court comes to its decision on his case, and it says two things. First, it rules that citizens of the United States can only be white. What they're saying here is Dred Scott's case could not possibly succeed because Dred Scott is not white, and a non-white person can't be a citizen, which means they can't sue someone in our courts. Scott, as a black man, has no citizenship, and thus he can't sue his owner. Here's what the Chief Justice, Roger Taney, writes. This is probably the most infamous line to ever come out of the U.S. Supreme Court. He says, non-whites have no rights that the white man is bound to respect. Okay, so what this suggests is that citizenship is only for native-born white Americans. This is a principle we're going to come back to at the very end of the class when we're talking about Reconstruction, because this principle is overthrown by the 14th Amendment to the Constitution, one of the Reconstruction amendments, that says any person born in the United States is a citizen, right? It overthrows Taney's ruling. But there's a more immediate and immediately significant ruling in Dred Scott, which is that the court ruled that Congress could never exclude slavery because it violated the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. That's a person's right to life, liberty, and property. preventing the spread of slavery anywhere was a violation of basic property rights. So what does that mean? Well, Abraham Lincoln, he's inspired to run for Senate by this decision. He's going to challenge the author of Kansas, Nebraska, Stephen Douglas. And Lincoln, like most Republicans and like most Northerners at this point, believes what that means is that the entire United States overnight has become a slave society. That it's only a matter of time before slave sales are happening at Quincy Market in Boston or on Broadway in New York, before enslaved people are working the land of upstate New York. Here's what Lincoln writes about that. Slavery's advocates will push it forward till it shall become alike lawful in all the states, old as well as new, north as well as south. That's the House divided speech in 1858. We have an economic collapse, another one, in 1857. Here's that caning of Charles Sumner. I should have shown you this before. This is Preston Brooks of South Carolina beating Sumner nearly to death. This is an extremely famous image spread throughout the North. You see the image of other slaveholding senators laughing, enjoying this in the background, blocking people who want to interfere. 1857, there's an economic collapse again. Hundreds of thousands of workers in the North are out of work. The stock market crashed. Banks collapse, they close, they disappear. Southerners blame Northern industrial capitalism for this. Northerners blame Southerners for being overly invested in cotton. It just sort of spikes the intensity of the moment. And then in 1859, John Brown, a veteran of Bleeding Kansas, a man who had been out there in the Bleeding Kansas Wars, a murderer of slaveholders, a radical, messianic, Old Testament figure. He and a small band attempt to seize the U.S. military's armory in Harper's Ferry, Virginia. Their plan is to seize all the weapons in the armory, arm enslaved people, and march through the South, killing slaveholders and emancipating the slaves and ending slavery forever. It doesn't work. Brown is executed, and he immediately becomes a martyr for the cause of anti-slavery, for his opposition to the slave power. Here's what Henry David Thoreau writes. Thoreau sees Brown as a sort of beautiful, heroic figure. He says, "You who pretend to care for Christ crucified, consider what you're about to do to him who offered himself to be the savior of 4 millions of men." John Brown, to Thoreau, is essentially Christ, and his execution is just as meaningful as the execution of Christ. Here's what Herman Melville wrote. Herman Melville's the author of Moby Dick. He's one of the great artists of the antebellum period, although a fairly obscure person in his own life. He writes this: "Hanging from the beam, slowly swaying, such the law, gaunt the shadow on your green Shenandoah," right? This is what you've done, Virginia. This is the shadow you've produced over yourself. "The cut is on the crown, lo, John Brown, and the stabs shall heal no more. Hidden in the cap is the anguish none can draw." Beneath this hood, hooded the executed man, what does his face reveal? "So your future veils its face, Shenandoah." Speaking to Virginia here, this is your future. The anguish that's on this man's face is what you have to look forward to. The pain that you've caused here is what you have to look forward to. "But the streaming beard is shown, weird John Brown, the meteor of the war." Melville called this poem the portent. A portent is a sign of things to come. It's a warning. Meteors, historically in many cultures, have been seen as portentous events. A meteor in the sky signals something's about to happen. John Brown, his body hanging in Virginia, is to Melville and to Thoreau and to millions of others a portentous meteor, a sign of things to come, a warning. There's a lot of meteors in the 1850s. That's where I'm going to leave it for now. And next time we're going to pick up thinking about what those things portended, what was to come. Thanks.